Lesson today is taken from the Gospel according to Luke, chapter 14, verses 1 and 7 through 14. On one occasion, when Jesus was going to the house of a leader of the Pharisees to eat a meal on the Sabbath, they were watching him closely. When he noticed how the guests chose the places of honor, he told them a parable. When you are invited by someone to a wedding banquet, do not sit down at the place of honor in case someone more distinguished than you has been invited by your host. And the host who invited both of you may come and say to you, "Give this person your place." And then in disgrace, you would start to take the lowest place. But when you are invited, go and sit down at the lowest place so that when your host comes, he may say to you, "Friend, move up higher." Then you will be honored in the presence of all who sit at the table with you. For all who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. He said also to the one who had invited him, "When you give a luncheon or a dinner, do not invite your friends or your brothers or your relatives or rich neighbors, in case they may invite you in return and you would be repaid. But when you give a banquet, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, and the blind, and you will be blessed, because they cannot repay you, for you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous." Well, each of us has this tendency to enter an environment and to then see it through a lens of our own interest. And so I don't know if you've ever done this. Like I go places with someone, and they will notice something that I would never have noticed. They would sit there and notice flowers, and I'm like, "What flowers?" Or they would notice the colors on the wall, okay? And I don't notice them. Now, I've mentioned, though, a number of times that one of my favorite shows was How I Met Your Mother. It's one of those re-binge shows for me. And I remember recently I noticed this, I posted it on my Facebook, because it was just an odd thing that you notice about yourself. There was an episode where the guest star, they had a lot of musical guest stars, but they had an episode where the guest star was Nicole Scherzinger. Okay, who was from the Pussycat Dolls, and she was recently in Sunset Boulevard, a revival of Sunset Boulevard, and one of the co-stars of that show was Kobe Smulders, who's now with the Avengers, and they have this scene together, and they're singing, and what I noticed was that I looked at this, and what I said was, "Those are Sennheiser wireless mics." Because that's my interest. Okay? So my interest is the AV. I walk into a place and I notice the tech. And I am looking at what the tech is. I'm noticing the speakers. I'm noticing the cameras. I'm noticing the microphones, because that's what I notice. And I wonder, when you go into an environment, what do you notice? Not just, like what you notice, but also who do you notice? Do you go to the center of attention and notice that person? Or are you the type of person who notices the one who is maybe standing alone off to the side? All right, the one who isn't talking to anyone, okay? What do you notice when you walk into a space? What you notice in a space actually says a fair amount about what your perspective is on the world. And so Jesus goes to this person's home for a meal on the Sabbath, and it says that they were watching him closely. Now, to connect this with the story we had last week, the previous story, was that Jesus had healed on the Sabbath last week, and he was very much criticized for doing that, okay? So in this story, he goes to eat a meal on the Sabbath, and they were watching him closely. But what they were watching for was whether he would conform to the Sabbath rules. See, they were looking for a way to criticize Jesus. All right? And that's one of the things that sometimes people do, right? I mean, we all know people who walk into a circumstance, and what they're looking for is the thing to pick on. All right? What they're looking for is the thing to criticize. All right? They're not necessarily very pleasant people to be around, but we know them. All right? And they go in and they're looking for what's wrong. They're not looking for what's right. So these folks were looking for a violation. They were watching Jesus to see what he might do that was a violation of the Sabbath law. And so this passage really is talking about how we move into a situation and see others. And in the way we see them, it changes the impact that we have on them. Are we going into a situation and lifting people up, or are we putting them down? Are we looking for the things they're doing right, or are we looking for ways to criticize them? Now, Jesus does his own looking. Jesus noticed how the guests chose the places of honor. See, while they were watching Jesus, of course, Jesus was watching them. And what Jesus noticed was their tendency for self-elevation. They wanted the best seat, the seat of honor at the dinner. And so what Jesus is looking at is their character. See, this is what Jesus notices in us, right? We notice what we care about. Jesus notices what Jesus cares about. And what Jesus cares about, of course, is what's in our heart. What's in our heart? What's our character like? How do we relate to others in a circumstance? And if we are the type of person who thinks too highly of ourselves, Jesus is warning us that that may not have the end that we want. He tells them a story. By the way, at this part, we're in the parable part of the story. So it says that Jesus sees what the people did. That's sort of the fact part of the story. And in response, he tells them a parable. So now we're in the made-up story part of the story that he tells in response to what he saw. So he tells them a story. And he says, look, if you go to the place of honor, then what may happen to you is that the host will come and you will be relegated to the lowest place. Now, in story mode, when Jesus is in tell a story mode, I tend to presume that Jesus is playing the role of the host or the homeowner or whatever, since, he's God, okay? And so he's kind of warning us that you may end up in disgrace, or actually this word in Greek means shame, all right? And the shame is kind of important as a difference, because the Greek word here for shame, disgrace is kind of something that happens to us on the outside, okay? You get disgraced, okay? This Greek word here means shame, and that shame, that sense of shame, actually incorporates this internal realization. So it's not just like externally being disgraced. It's you come to an internal realization that, you know what? You're not as hot as you thought you were. You're not the big deal you thought you were, okay? And if you try to grab the place of honor, you may discover, much to your chagrin, that you did not deserve the place of honor. You may have to face the realization that you're not that good. And it's too easy, right, for us to overestimate ourselves. Every single survey of every kind. I've often mentioned this because I just think it's hilarious as a preacher that, this survey they did of Presbyterian pastors, and they asked them to rate themselves on their preaching ability, and zero rated themselves as below average. Okay? We're all like the pastors of the First Presbyterian Church of Lake Wobegon, right? Everybody's above average, all right? Same thing happens with everything else. Driving. Everybody thinks they are a better driver than the average person on the road. Everybody thinks that the other person is the one who can't drive well, all right? Integrity. Everybody thinks that their standard of integrity is the right standard, and it's other people who lack it, okay? So, who overestimates themselves? Do you believe you overestimate yourself? It's an interesting reversal. See, if you talk about people, this is by the way something that preachers understand, talking to each other all the time about preaching. Okay, if you sit there and say, A lot of people have this tendency to overestimate themselves. If the first person that comes to your mind is somebody else, that's often an indicator of an issue. If the first person that comes to your mind is he talking about me? That's actually a sign of you're in a good place, okay? That you're in a better place, because you're sitting there and you are automatically having the humility to think that maybe the issue is one in you, and the more, the best antidote to having an issue is when we're constantly worrying about whether we have the issue, right? It's kind of like that's true of narcissists, right? I mean, no narcissist thinks they're a narcissist. And the people who are worried about whether they're narcissists aren't, because they're worried about it. All right? And so the same thing happens with this sort of thing. All right? So easy to overestimate where we are. And it's life that will issue the corrective. See, Jesus says that, when you're invited, take the lowest place. Take the humble place. Take the place of saying, yeah, you know what? Maybe I'm not the one in this group who deserves to be in the highest spot. And when you do that, the host may come and say to you, friend, move up higher. That when the one who sees you fully, the one who knows who you are, sees you fully and sees your worth, they may elevate you. All right? And that's something that's so important in our lives. One of the questions really is to reflect and say, who elevated you in your life? Who's the person in your life who at some point saw you and said to you, you know what? You are capable of more than you think you are. You've got more potential than you realize you have. Who's the person who at some point in your life saw the obstacles that you're facing and tried to make your road easier? Who's the person who maybe gave you a chance, or a second chance, or a third chance, when maybe you weren't sure you deserved one? Who elevated you in your life? Because that is the person who really has made a difference, all right? And Jesus is saying that, we need to be people who are worried less about exalting ourselves and more about humbling ourselves in our relationships with others. And what does it mean to be humble? It's not about self-deprecation. That ends up often being a false humility. Okay? Don't deny what you're actually good at. All right? It's not about self-deprecation. And false humility is the worst, because that's people who are just usually like fishing for compliments. Okay? But I loved the definition of humility from Rick Warren, who wrote that great book, Purpose-Driven Life. And one of the things he said was that humility is not thinking less of yourself, but thinking of yourself less. See, C.S. Lewis, who's also a great, great writer, at some point said, he gave a bad definition where he said that the humble man is one who does not think of himself. And I don't think that that's correct. It's not about self-deprecation. It's not about thinking less of yourself. But rather it is about thinking of others instead of you. All right? It's about walking into that room and not thinking that you're the middle. I mean, we've all known people who do that, right? We've all known, ever been with somebody who got a spot on their outfit and they were mortified and they said, oh, I can't go to the party. I can't go to that gathering. I've got this spot on my outfit and everyone's going to notice and everyone's going to think I'm a slob and all that kind of thing. And you're thinking, half the people will not notice that you're even there. And the other half won't care that you have a spot on your outfit, okay? but they walk into a room believing that their entrance is going to make them the center of attention in the room when they're not. All right. Humility is just thinking about others. It's thinking about others before you're thinking about yourself. And when we see others as Jesus does, we'll actually see ourselves appropriately. It's not about a ranking. It's not about a comparison. It's about seeing people's character. It's about seeing people's potential, right? Not seeing them in terms of their status, not seeing them in terms of their achievement, but rather, how do we see the people in a circumstance? For example, how do we see the people as Jesus talks about them in this very simple instruction when he says to them, look, when you give a banquet, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, and the blind. What do you see when you see those words? What do you see in his reference to the poor, the lame, and the blind? I believe that if all you see is charity, I think you're kind of missing the point of what Jesus is talking about, all right? Because I don't think Jesus is simply saying, hey, do an act of charity. Give these people some food. I don't really think that's the way Jesus sees this. Instead, I think when Jesus says, when you give a banquet, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, and the blind, I think Jesus wants us to understand that when you invite these persons who would otherwise not be invited, they make the party better. Their presence improves the party. All right? They are the ones who would ordinarily be excluded from the party, and their absence isn't just bad for them, it's bad for us. Their absence makes the party worse. That's one of the reasons why in our world, right, diversity is such an important thing in our world, because diversity incorporates the gifts that everyone brings, the perspectives everyone brings. Diversity makes us all stronger and better. To notice the overlooked is to see their potential. See, we so often overlook people who have tremendous potential, and that's what we should be looking at. All right? We shouldn't just be discarding people because we've presumed that they don't have something to give. All right? We shouldn't just see the poor, the crippled, the lame, and the blind. When Jesus says invite them to the party, it shouldn't just be because, they're overlooked. It should be because they've got maybe incredible personalities and stories and are just lovely people who will make the party better. And we hurt the party when we don't invite them. I think many of us, especially when we're younger in life, really want people to see our potential. We hate it. Don't you hate it? When you ever had a job interview where you had all the perfect potential to do it, blah, 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 but you fell into the experience trap? Okay. I can't keep, I know you've got great potential, but you don't have experience. All right. I really think employers who do that are making a huge mistake. All right. Because half the time, to be honest, I think the people with experience have only proven that they're not really excellent. I'll take potential every time. I love looking for the people who have potential that can be unleashed. Because when you take the person who doesn't have the experience, but they've got the potential, they're eager, they're energetic, they want to prove what they can do. And to give them that chance, to give them that opportunity, to recognize within them that they've got potential, I think that's an amazing thing to be able to do for people. I think unleashing the potential in people is the goal. And Jesus says, look, invite people, and you'll be blessed. You know, they can't repay you, but you'll be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous. See, in the employment example I gave, unleashing potential helps you directly. But there are a lot of people in our lives who unleash potential in us at an age, at a time when they may never see the result of doing that. And as a result, they won't ever see what they did. And we don't appreciate that enough. We don't appreciate the people out there in the world who unleash potential in others in a way where they don't get repaid. Who does that the most, at least in my life? Teachers. Okay. Especially young teachers of younger kids, right? Because, right when you're young, that's when so many of your self-images are formed. That's when so many of you, that's when you get infused with so many messages inside you of whether you are a kid who can versus a kid who can't. How many people are discouraged because, from ever trying, you name it, whether it's math or science or music or art or sports or whatever it is, how many of them had whatever potential they had in those areas quashed when they were like 8? That all it took was one person at that age to either say, you can do it, you've got talent, or you don't, or you got laughed at, you flubbed up, and you never tried it again. But because that kind of encouragement, that unleashing of potential occurs so early in life when it's really important, but the benefits are so much delayed, I think that's why teachers are so underpaid. Because the value they bring, the value they deliver to people comes so much later in life. On the other hand, right, SAT coaches make a fortune. Right? Because the payoff is right now. All right? The payoff is short term. I'll pay you a fortune to work with my kid for 6 months and try and raise his SATs by 100 points by November or whatever. Right? They make a fortune because the payoff is quick. But some of the most important unleashing of potential has a result that is so far down the road, there's no reward for the person. And yet, for anything any of us does well, someone told you you could before you could. Somebody told you you could before you could. And that's what got you going. So I want you to think about, it's a holiday weekend, it's a time to reflect. Right? Who lifted you up? Who do you owe a debt of gratitude to that you can't repay? And on this Labor Day weekend, when kids are getting ready to go back to school, I can tell you some of mine names that you won't know, couldn't know. I can't even find them on Google because they kind of went home to the Lord well before, stuff was on the internet. But Frances Wagner was my first grade teacher, and she took a real interest in my own potential. I remember she actually asked to come to dinner and talk to my parents about school, and she was my first grade teacher. I ended up skipping second grade. She didn't want me to be discouraged, so I skipped second grade. Betty Sider, Mrs. Sider was my fourth grade teacher, and she was the first person I ever told I was going to major in chemistry when I went to college. which I did. In high school, in ROTC, Sergeant Milt Montner, a decorated Vietnam vet, taught me more about leadership than anyone else in my life. Pulled me aside, taught me very practical life lessons about relating to people. It was Sergeant Montner who taught me the core principle of leadership, which is that it is not about barking orders at people. There are people who saw potential in me, nurtured it. They were all in their 50s or 60s when I was 15 years old or younger. So, they've all gone to be with the Lord. And I will only repay them in heaven. I will only see them when we're together with the Lord and able to say to them, thank you. Thank you for the impact you had on my life. Okay? And I wonder who those people are for you. I wonder if you take a moment over this weekend as we reflect on people. That's what Labor Day is about, right? Labor Day is a day to celebrate workers and celebrate all those who made the holiday possible. Celebrate all those in the labor movement in the United States who are the reason why we have weekends. They lifted up the American worker, sometimes at the cost of violence, sometimes at the cost of their jobs. They lifted up the American worker. And tomorrow is a day when we celebrate what they did for us. So I wonder, who lifted you up? And more importantly, or as important, who will someday say that you elevated them? See, I talked about Mrs. Wagner and Mrs. Sider and Sergeant Montner, and I wonder, for each of us, isn't a worthy life goal to be on that list for someone else? A worthy life goal is someday, and maybe it would be when we are with the Lord and it's something we only see from heaven. Right? But a worthy life goal would be that when someone talks to someone else about their life and about who elevated them, who lifted them up, who told them they could do what they didn't realize they could do, and propelled them in a direction they weren't sure they would go. Wouldn't it be awesome to be on that list for someone else? So when you see somebody, when you walk into a room and you see the people, do you see their mistakes or do you see their potential? Because no one achieves, no one becomes great entirely on their own. It starts with other people lifting them up. Everything we achieve is aided by someone around us. It starts with somebody lifting us up. And it often starts with someone telling us that we can before we know we can. Because what they saw in us was not where we were, but where we could be. They didn't see what we had done before, but they saw what we might do in the future. And that, to be that for someone else, would be a wonderful goal for us to achieve in our lives. Amen.